They said no one could look at her face and forget what they saw. The way she crumpled to the floor. The sound her body made when it hit the cold tile. The screams of her children echoing through the neighborhood like a siren that wouldn't stop. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in suburban Ohio. Neighbors were mowing lawns. Kids were riding bikes up and down the street. Nothing about that day suggested that within seconds, a family of 4 would be reduced to chaos and grief. David Whitaker stood in the middle of his living room. Hands shaking. Eyes wide. A 9mm pistol still clutched between his fingers. His wife Lillian lay motionless by the TV stand. Blood pooling around her light blue sweater. Their 2 children, Noah age 14 and Emily age 10, stood frozen near the dining table. Neither of them could scream anymore. They had already screamed themselves hoarse. Neighbors rushed outside, drawn by the noise. Some stood on their porches, unsure of what they had just heard. One neighbor, Mr. Reyes, bolted across the street, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm and practiced. 911, what's your emergency? There's been a shooting, Mr. Reyes said. Next door. The Whitaker house. The husband. I think he shot his wife. The kids, they're still inside. Police units arrived within minutes. David was still standing in the same spot when officers stormed through the door, weapons drawn. He dropped the gun without protest. Laid face down on the floor. Silent. Expressionless. Before we continue with the rest of this heart-wrenching story, take a second to like this video if you believe true crime cases like this need to be told. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next episode. What could make a husband, after 20 years of marriage, pull the trigger with his kids watching? Was this a crime of passion, or something that had been building for years? Stay with us. Let's rewind. David and Lillian Whitaker met during their senior year of college. He was majoring in business administration. She was studying elementary education. They weren't the kind of couple that made headlines. Friends described them as normal, steady, and low drama. After graduation, they married in a small church ceremony attended by close friends and family. David landed a job as an operations manager at a local manufacturing plant. Lillian became a second-grade teacher at the elementary school just a few miles from their home. For nearly 2 decades, life appeared stable. The couple bought a modest 3-bedroom house, had 2 kids, attended PTA meetings, hosted small barbecues in the summer. They paid their mortgage on time, went on family road trips, celebrated anniversaries with dinner at the same Italian restaurant every year. But beneath that carefully constructed routine, something else was happening. According to close friends, David had always been a little distant. Even before the kids were born, Lillian often complained that he worked too many hours, spent too much time at the office, and rarely opened up emotionally. He wasn't physically abusive, never raised a hand to her. But the distance between them was there, growing year after year. By their 15th wedding anniversary, Lillian started making changes. She joined a fitness class, started wearing brighter colors, took a weekend trip to visit her sister out of state, something she hadn't done in years. David noticed, but said nothing. When Lillian got a promotion at work and started coming home later, David grew suspicious. Friends said the arguments started small. Disagreements about dinner plans, frustration over missed calls, little things that grew into bigger things. One evening, their son Noah overheard them arguing in the garage. Words like betrayal and lies were thrown around. It wasn't long before rumors of infidelity began to circulate. Lillian had grown close to a fellow teacher at her school, Mark Reynolds. They were often seen leaving school events together, grabbing coffee, sitting too close during parent-teacher conferences. Whether or not there was anything more than friendship, no one could say for sure. But to David, perception was enough. A few weeks before the shooting, David's behavior changed. He started leaving work early, checking Lillian's phone when she wasn't looking, following her car after school. Noah once told a friend at school, "My dad's acting weird lately. He follows mom around like he's a detective or something." Tensions hit a breaking point one evening when David confronted Lillian about her relationship with Mark. She denied everything, said Mark was just a friend. said David was being paranoid. That night, David slept on the couch. Days later, Lillian packed a small bag and took the kids to stay at her sister's house for a weekend. David spent those nights alone, angry, brooding. On Monday morning, she returned with the kids, acting as though nothing had happened, trying to keep life normal for Noah and Emily. But for David, normal had left the house a long time ago. According to police records, David purchased the handgun just 10 days before the shooting. Legally, background check cleared. No previous criminal record. On the morning of the incident, neighbors reported seeing David pacing on his front porch around 7 a.m. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stared at the street like he was waiting for something, or someone. By noon, Lillian had prepared lunch for the kids. They were eating sandwiches at the dining table when David walked in from the garage, holding the gun. Witnesses from across the street said they heard Lillian scream just once. It was over in seconds. David never tried to run. The police report says when officers handcuffed him and led him out of the house, he kept repeating the same sentence. "She lied to me. She lied to me. She lied to me." As paramedics worked on Lillian's body, neighbors held Noah and Emily outside, wrapping them in blankets. Both children were in shock, unable to speak. But what David didn't know, what no one knew at that moment, was that Lillian had been keeping a secret. One that would change the entire direction of this case. A secret David never found out, until it was too late. What was that secret? Before we continue, leave a comment below. Do you think anything could have stopped this tragedy before it happened? Also, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The police station was quiet except for the low hum of overhead lights and the distant sound of someone typing at a desk. David sat in an interview room, his hands cuffed to the metal table, staring down at the floor. His shirt was still stained from earlier. His knuckles were scraped from punching the living room wall after the shooting. Two detectives sat across from him, flipping through a thin folder of preliminary reports. Detective Hall cleared his throat. "David, do you understand the charges against you?" David didn't answer. Detective Hall tried again. "You shot your wife, in front of your children. Is there anything you want to say?" David lifted his head just enough to whisper, "She lied to me." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Noah and Emily were being examined for shock. Neither of them could fully process what had happened. Emily kept asking for her mom, over and over again. Noah sat silent, his eyes fixed on the tiled floor. The same floor where, just hours earlier, he had watched his father pull the trigger. But there was something else Noah hadn't told anyone. Something he'd seen. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to share. Before we continue, if you've made it this far into the story, please take a second to like this video. Your support helps us keep going. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind tragic crimes. Now back to the case. Detectives began collecting everything they could from the Whitaker home. Phone records, emails, social media posts. They interviewed neighbors, friends, even Lillian's co-workers at the elementary school. That's when the first cracks in the story began to appear. One co-worker mentioned that Lillian had been acting strange in the weeks before her death. Not because of any affair, but because she'd been making secret phone calls during her lunch breaks. Another colleague recalled Lillian stepping out during recess duty to take calls, her face pale when she returned. At first, police assumed it was connected to Mark Reynolds, the man David had suspected all along. But when detectives pulled Lillian's phone records, a different number kept appearing. A number that wasn't Mark's. The calls were frequent, short in length, usually between 2 to 4 minutes. The number traced back to a lawyer's office across town. Detective Hall paid the law office a visit. After presenting a warrant, he sat down with one of the junior associates. The news stunned everyone involved. Lillian hadn't been planning a romantic getaway. She hadn't been having secret meetings with Mark. She had been working with an attorney to file for full custody of Noah and Emily, and to serve David with divorce papers. The papers had been ready for delivery, scheduled for Monday morning, 2 days after the shooting. Detectives now had a clearer picture. David's paranoia, the arguments, the growing distance. It wasn't just about suspected infidelity. It was about control. Lillian had been preparing to leave him, quietly, carefully, without giving him time to react. But he had sensed it anyway. One of Lillian's close friends told investigators. She didn't want him to know until it was final. She was afraid of what he'd do if he found out she was taking the kids. When detectives informed David about the divorce papers during his next interview, his face went pale. He slumped back in the chair and let out a slow, heavy breath. For the first time since his arrest, he started to cry. Back at the family home, forensic teams discovered additional evidence. In the garage, officers found a small box of personal items. Photos of Lillian and the kids, wedding mementos, even love notes from their early years. But taped to the bottom of the box was a folded letter, written by Lillian, addressed to David. Read, "David, I don't want this to end like this. But I can't live like this anymore. The kids deserve better. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to make this choice." The letter was dated 3 days before the shooting. Detectives showed the letter to David during his next interview. His reaction was chilling. Without looking up, he said, "She was going to take everything from me. My kids, my home, everything." Meanwhile, friends and family began preparing for Lillian's funeral. The community organized a memorial at the school where she had taught for 12 years. Parents of her students brought flowers. Her students created drawings and goodbye notes to display in her classroom. But the investigation wasn't over. One of the biggest unanswered questions remained. Where did David get the gun? David had never owned a firearm before. No hunting trips. No shooting range visits. Not even a concealed carry permit. Detectives traced the weapon's serial number. It had been purchased from a private seller just 10 days prior. That seller was one of David's co-workers from the manufacturing plant. The co-worker told police that David had approached him during a lunch break, asking if he still had the handgun he had mentioned in passing months earlier. The co-worker admitted selling it to David, off the books, for $300 cash. No questions asked. Detectives asked if David seemed upset or angry when buying the gun. The co-worker hesitated before answering. He said he just wanted it for home protection. But looking back, he didn't seem right that day. He was off. As the pieces came together, prosecutors started building their case. First-degree murder, child endangerment, illegal possession of a firearm. Emotional testimonies from Noah and Emily would play a key role in the trial. But there was one more thing. One more twist that even the police hadn't expected. During a final review of Lillian's phone, a message was found. An unsent draft. It simply read, "If something happens to me, check the garage floor under the old toolbox." Detectives returned to the Whitaker home immediately. They lifted the toolbox, and what they found underneath changed everything. What was hidden under that toolbox? Before we go, what do you think Lillian left for the police to find? Drop your guesses in the comments below. Detectives pulled on their gloves and carefully lifted the heavy metal toolbox off the dusty garage floor. Years of oil stains and dirt covered the concrete beneath. At first glance, nothing stood out. Just layers of grime and a few scattered screws. But as they ran a flashlight across the ground, something caught the beam. Tucked into a shallow crack in the cement, wrapped tightly in a plastic grocery bag, was a small black object. An audio recorder. They exchanged a quick glance. One detective pulled it free and carefully placed it into an evidence bag. Back at the station, the device was cleaned and connected to a speaker. They pressed play. A voice filled the room. It was Lillian. The recording was dated 5 days before the shooting. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "If you're hearing this, I guess I couldn't do it in time. I've been scared for weeks now. David's temper, it's different. He watches me when I sleep, checks my phone when I leave the room, follows me when I drive to work. I thought if I waited until Monday things would calm down, but I don't know anymore. Something happens to me, please take care of my kids. Please, tell them I love them." The room went silent. The detectives exchanged a look of disbelief. This changed everything. It wasn't just a sudden outburst. This was premeditated. Lillian had feared for her life. The recording became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Meanwhile, news of the discovery leaked to the press. Headlines appeared across local media. Wife predicted her own murder days before shooting. Tragic voice recording reveals victim's final plea. At school, Lillian's co-workers and students were devastated. Parents gathered for a candlelight vigil in her honor. Children left flowers at the school gate. At home, Noah sat in his bedroom staring at the ceiling for hours at a time. Emily clung to her aunt, refusing to sleep alone. Family members arranged counseling for both children, but the trauma of what they had witnessed stayed with them. The prosecutors wasted no time filing additional charges against David. First-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. They argued that the recording showed David's state of mind, that he had created an environment of fear and control leading up to the murder. David's defense attorney, however, pushed back hard. They argued that the recording only reflected Lillian's perception, not David's intentions. They claimed David had suffered a mental breakdown, that he acted in the heat of the moment. They brought in a psychologist who testified that David showed signs of emotional collapse from perceived abandonment. During cross-examination, the prosecution didn't hold back. They showed the jury photos of the crime scene, the living room wall with its bloodstains, the discarded handgun near the foot of the stairs, and most damaging of all, they played the audio recording in full. Jurors listened with wide eyes and clenched jaws. Some glanced toward David. He sat at the defense table, staring down at his hands. But the most emotional moment came when Noah took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he entered. He sat, fidgeting with his hands, looking anywhere but at his father. When asked to describe what he saw that day, Noah's voice trembled. "We were eating lunch. Mom was laughing at something Emily said. I saw Dad come in from the garage. I thought he was holding something, but I didn't know what at first." The prosecutor asked, "What happened next?" Noah's voice dropped to a whisper. He pointed it at her. She said, "David, please don't." And then, he shot her. Some jurors turned away. One wiped tears from her eyes. When asked if he ever heard his parents fight in the days before the shooting, Noah nodded. They argued almost every night. About everything. About her coming home late. About her phone. About her wanting to leave. Noah's testimony lasted less than 15 minutes. But its impact was undeniable. Emily did not testify. Her therapist advised against it. Instead, her recorded interview with Child Protective Services was played for the court. Her small voice, shaky and broken, described the moment she saw her mother fall. The defense continued pushing the narrative of emotional instability. They portrayed David as a stressed, overworked man, blindsided by the fear of losing his family. But as more evidence surfaced, that argument became harder to support. Text messages from David to a coworker showed a pattern of obsessive thoughts. Messages like, "If she leaves me, I have nothing. She thinks she can take my kids and just walk away? No one's taking my family from me." The prosecution rested its case with a final haunting reminder. Lillian didn't die because of a single bad decision. She died because of a pattern. A pattern of control, fear, and ultimately violence. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following week. But as the jury prepared to deliberate, one more discovery brought the entire courtroom to a standstill. Inside David's work locker, investigators found something that had been overlooked during the initial search. A notebook, filled with disturbing entries. Pages and pages of David's handwriting. Dates, times, observations. Notes about Lillian's daily routines. Where she drove, who she spoke to. Even sketches of their home floor plan, with markings showing points of entry and places to hide. On the final page, written in bold, angry letters, just 4 words stood alone. "Make sure it ends." When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood. The judge asked, "On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant?" The response came without hesitation. "Guilty." David Whitaker sat motionless. No reaction. No tears. Just silence. But this story still wasn't over. Because during sentencing, David would reveal something that no one in the courtroom was prepared to hear. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. Family members, friends, reporters, and members of the community filled every seat. Some stood along the walls just to witness the final moments of a case that had shaken their neighborhood. Lillian's sister sat in the front row, holding Emily close. Noah sat between his aunt and a counselor from Victim Services, eyes down, arms crossed tightly over his chest. David entered the room in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed at his waist. His face was thinner, hollow. But there was something else in his expression. A look that hadn't been there during the trial. A kind of quiet determination. As the judge read through the sentencing guidelines, David sat perfectly still. But just as the judge was about to deliver the final sentence, David's defense attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said, "the defendant has a statement he wishes to make before sentencing." A low ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. David rose slowly from his chair. His voice when he spoke was steady. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he began. "I know what I did. I know I took something from my children they can never get back." Noah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. David's gaze stayed fixed on the judge. "But there's something I need to say, because no one in this room knows the full truth. Not the jury. Not the police. Not even my own lawyer." A murmur swept through the courtroom. David took a shaky breath. 3 weeks before Lillian died, I found something. Hidden in her car. He paused. Looked down at the floor. A burner phone. A collective gasp filled the room. I went through it, David continued. There were messages, dozens of them. They weren't from Mark. They weren't from anyone I knew. They were from someone else. Someone she met online. They talked about running away together. Taking the kids. Starting a new life. Lillian's sister stood up. That's a lie, she shouted before the judge banged his gavel. David didn't flinch. I confronted her about it. She denied everything. Said it was just a friend. Said I was imagining things. But the messages, they were there. The judge asked the courtroom to settle down. David went on. I'm not standing here saying what I did was right. It wasn't. Nothing can make it right. But people keep asking why. Why would I do this after 20 years of marriage? Why would I snap like that? He turned his head slightly toward Noah and Emily. I just couldn't watch her destroy what we built. I couldn't let her take my kids and leave me with nothing. The judge ordered a short recess. The prosecution quickly called detectives to confirm whether any additional phones had been found in the original evidence. Detective Hall took the stand. We did not recover any second phone from the crime scene, Your Honor, he stated. And no records from her carrier showed an extra line or burner phone registered in her name. The judge nodded. Mr. Whitaker, the judge said, turning back to David, do you have proof of this phone? David shook his head. I threw it in the river, the day after I found it. Whispers filled the courtroom again. Some believed him. Some didn't. The judge proceeded with sentencing. On the charge of first-degree murder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charge of child endangerment. 15 years to be served consecutively. As the sentence was read, Lillian's sister broke down in tears. Noah stared straight ahead, expression blank. Emily sobbed quietly into her aunt's shoulder. But as David was led out of the courtroom, something strange happened. He turned back and smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It wasn't full of joy. But it was unmistakably a smile. Later that evening, after the courtroom cleared, Detective Hall sat at his desk reviewing final paperwork on the case. A knock at his door interrupted him. It was a young officer from the evidence unit. Detective, we found something, the officer said, holding up a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a phone. Burnt orange casing. Recovered from the drainage pipe behind the Whitaker property. Hall's heart sank. The phone wasn't listed in the original evidence log. Had they missed it? Or had someone planted it later? The detective powered it on. The battery was almost dead, but just enough juice remained. As the screen flickered to life, one text thread appeared. Dozens of messages. Sent and received. All between Lillian and an unsaved number. Hall scrolled quickly. The messages weren't from Mark Reynolds. They weren't from a friend. They were from someone else. Someone no one had interviewed yet. The contact name was simple. Just 4 letters. Eric. Detective Hall stared at the screen. Eric? Who was Eric? And why had Lillian kept this phone hidden? With a deep sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed the number listed as Eric. It rang and rang. Until finally, someone answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was male. Young. Nervous. Who is this? Hall asked. The line went dead. Hall stood quickly, grabbing his coat. The case wasn't over. Not yet. Detective Hall lowered the phone from his ear, staring at the screen as the call disconnected. The number wasn't local. It traced back to a prepaid service with no registered name. A burner line. Who was Eric? Hall pulled up Lillian's full contact history again. No other mention of that name anywhere. No saved contacts. No emails. No social media references. But the messages on the burner phone told a different story. They started casual, playful even. Miss you already? When can I see you again? But as the dates moved closer to the week of the murder, the tone changed. We need to leave soon. He's getting suspicious. And most disturbing of all, if anything happens to me, you know what to do. Detective Hall leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. For the first time in weeks, the story was shifting. First thing the next morning, Hall placed an emergency trace on the burner number. Pinged, once, on the east side of Cleveland. A rundown neighborhood with rows of aging apartment buildings. By noon, officers were knocking on doors. After 2 hours of dead ends, a tenant on the 3rd floor recognized the number. That's Eric Thomas, she said. Lived here a few months. Kept to himself. Worked nights. I think at a warehouse nearby. But I haven't seen him for a few days. Detectives checked employment records. Eric Thomas, age 28, warehouse worker. No prior criminal record. But when they arrived at his listed workplace, he was gone. Hadn't shown up for work since the night of David's sentencing. Hall felt his stomach drop. Who was this man? And how deep did this connection with Lillian really go? As officers began searching for Eric, Detective Hall returned to the evidence room to examine the burner phone more closely. Hidden within the settings was a draft message. Unsent. It simply read, "If I disappear, ask David about the storage unit." The storage unit? Hall immediately requested a warrant. That afternoon, they arrived at Lakeside Storage on the edge of town. The manager led them down a narrow row of units until they stood in front of Unit 47B. The lock was old but still intact. Hall snapped the bolt with a cutter and pulled the door upward. Inside, several plastic storage bins lined the floor. In the first bin, old toys, children's books, and framed family photos. But the second bin told a different story. Inside were handwritten letters. Stacks of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds. All addressed to Lillian. All from Eric. Each letter detailed their meetings, their conversations, their plans. But one letter stood out from the rest. It was dated 2 weeks before the murder. Hall unfolded the paper and began to read. "Lillian, I can't keep waiting. You promised we'd leave. You said you'd talk to him. I'm tired of hiding. If you don't tell him by next week, I will." The detective froze. Eric had been threatening to expose the affair. Was this the pressure that pushed Lillian to act? Or David? As Hall continued sifting through the bin, he found something else. A small black pistol. Fully loaded. Serial number scratched off. Hall stared at the weapon in disbelief. Could Lillian have bought this gun? Or Eric? The lab would need to run ballistic tests. But questions were already piling up faster than answers. Back at the station, Hall called in the district attorney. They reviewed the new evidence in silence. "This doesn't change David's guilt," the DA finally said, flipping through the letters. "He still pulled the trigger." Hall nodded. "But it changes the story," he said quietly. That night, as Hall sat at his desk typing up a report, a young officer walked in holding a printed document. "Detective, you're going to want to see this." It was Eric Thomas's flight record. 2 days after the murder, Eric had booked a one-way ticket to Mexico City. Hall's heart raced. Eric was on the run. The next morning, a bolo, "Be on the lookout," was issued statewide for Eric Thomas. But before they could track him down, another twist came. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station. No return address. Type. No handwriting. Read. "You're chasing the wrong man." Asked Detective Hall why he never mentioned what he found in David's garage 2 months ago. Hall froze. 2 months ago? Before the murder even happened? What was this about? Hall rushed to the evidence archives. He pulled up old case logs from a noise complaint filed at the Whitaker residence 8 weeks prior. Back then, officers had done a routine welfare check after neighbors heard shouting. The file mentioned something odd. A metal box with surveillance photos. Dozens of images, taken from outside Lillian's school, from across the street from Mark Reynolds' home, even from playgrounds where Noah and Emily played. David had been spying on Lillian, stalking her movements for weeks. But the file had been marked non-criminal and left in storage. Hall buried his face in his hands. How had they missed this? David hadn't been just paranoid. He had been planning, plotting, watching. Hall pulled out the folder of photos. The timestamp on the images matched days when David had told police he was at work. But David had lied. Again. Just as Hall was about to close the file, something caught his attention. One of the surveillance photos showed a man standing near Lillian's car at her school parking lot. The man was tall, thin-built. Zooming in, Hall's stomach twisted. It was Eric, captured in David's own surveillance photos. Hall sat back. Now it made sense. David had known about Eric long before Lillian thought he did. He had watched them both, tracked their movements, and when Lillian started making plans to leave, David snapped. But that didn't explain one thing. Why did Eric vanish the night of the sentencing? Where was he now? And what was he hiding? Hall stood from his desk, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. There was one more person he needed to question before this case could truly close. Detective Hall pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a rundown motel just off the interstate. The tip had come from a gas station clerk who remembered seeing Eric Thomas earlier that afternoon buying bottled water and snacks. Room 214. Hall approached cautiously, one hand resting on his sidearm. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked twice. No answer. Pushing the door open, Hall stepped inside. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. On the bed sat an open duffel bag half-packed with clothes and toiletries. A prepaid cell phone lay charging on the nightstand. But no Eric. Hall scanned the room and noticed a piece of paper folded neatly on the desk. It was a bus ticket. Departure time, 6:30 p.m. Destination, Laredo, Texas. Border town. The clock on the wall read 5:42 p.m. Hall grabbed the phone and the note and rushed back to his car. With sirens off but speed unchecked, he raced toward the Greyhound station downtown. When he arrived, passengers were already lining up at Gate 3 for the Laredo bus. Hall spotted him instantly. Eric Thomas stood near the back of the line. Hood pulled over his head. Backpack slung over one shoulder. Eyes darting nervously. Hall approached fast. "Eric Thomas?" he called out. Eric froze. Turned. Their eyes met. Without warning, Eric bolted. Hall gave chase through the terminal, weaving between luggage carts and startled travelers. Eric made it as far as the exit doors before Hall tackled him to the ground. With help from station security, Eric was cuffed and loaded into the back of a squad car. At the station, Hall sat across from him in the interview room. Eric refused to make eye contact. "You've been avoiding us for weeks," Hall said. "Want to explain why?" Eric shrugged. Stayed silent. Hall placed a printout of the text messages between Eric and Lillian on the table. "These are from the phone we found behind David's garage," Hall said. "You want to deny this too?" Eric's hands shook slightly. Hall pressed further. "Lillian was planning to leave David with you. That much we know. What we don't know is what role you played in all this." Eric finally looked up. His voice was low. "Dry. I didn't kill her, if that's what you're thinking." Hall leaned forward. "Then help me understand why you disappeared the night of the sentencing." Eric hesitated. "I panicked. I figured with David locked up, people would start looking at me next." Hall tilted his head. "Why would anyone look at you if you had nothing to hide?" Eric's lips tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer. He took a deep breath. "There's something you don't know," Eric said. Hall sat back, giving him space to talk. Eric rubbed his hands over his face. "A week before Lillian died, she asked me for something. Something I didn't want to give her." Hall narrowed his eyes. "What was it?" Eric's gaze dropped to the floor. "She wanted a gun." Hall felt the air in the room change. "You're telling me? Lillian was trying to buy a weapon? From you?" Eric nodded slowly. "I told her no. I didn't want to get involved. But she kept asking. Said she didn't feel safe. Said David had been acting strange." Hall scribbled a quick note. "Why didn't you tell us this earlier?" Eric laughed bitterly. "Because I knew how it would sound. I'm the secret boyfriend, running from the cops, and she's the one who ends up dead. You think anyone would believe me?" Hall stayed silent. Eric went on. "The night before it happened, she texted me. Said she changed her mind about waiting for Monday to leave him. Said she was going to tell him everything the next day." Hall's heart sank. That meant Lillian's confrontation with David may have happened earlier than anyone thought. Eric leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I swear I didn't kill her. But if you check her messages, she was scared. Scared enough to think David was capable of something like this." Hall nodded. "We already found the messages." Eric exhaled deeply. For the next hour, Eric walked detectives through the entire history of his relationship with Lillian. They had met at a local coffee shop nearly a year earlier. Casual conversations turned into private meetings. Private meetings turned into late-night drives, and eventually something more. Lillian confided in Eric about her marriage troubles. The control. The emotional distance. The growing fear. But Eric swore that when Lillian told him she was filing for divorce, she never once mentioned wanting to harm David. The new information gave prosecutors more leverage. While Eric wasn't charged with any crime, he remained on a watch list as a material witness. But even with these new details, one thing still haunted Detective Hall. The surveillance photos David had taken. The notebook filled with obsessive notes. The sketch of the floor plan. And most troubling of all, that final line written in David's handwriting. "Make sure it ends." Hall couldn't shake the feeling that there was still a missing piece. Later that night, Hall reviewed David's old work schedule. According to time clock records, David had left work early on multiple days in the month before the murder. Security footage from local streets near Lillian's school showed David's car parked nearby during those same hours. But one piece of footage stood out. A grainy clip from a nearby gas station showed David filling his gas tank on the morning of the murder. Time-stamped just 1 hour before Lillian's death. David was wearing gloves. On a warm spring day, Hall checked the weather report from that day. Temperature, 78 degrees. No reason for gloves, unless he planned on using them. The more Hall dug, the more premeditated it all appeared. But just when Hall thought the case was fully closed, a phone call came in from the state crime lab. Ballistics results. The gun found in David's garage, the one wrapped in the storage bin with the letters from Eric, didn't match the bullets recovered from Lillian's body. The second weapon was still missing. Hall's stomach dropped. If David hadn't used that gun, where was the murder weapon? And more importantly, who had it now? Detective Hall sat in his office staring at the lab report. The bullets recovered from Lillian's body didn't match the gun found in David's garage. The weapon David had supposedly used wasn't the weapon that killed her. For a brief moment, Hall wondered if this could be a clerical error. He picked up the phone and called the crime lab supervisor personally. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked. The answer came back without hesitation. 100%, the supervisor replied. Different caliber, different barrel markings. The gun from the garage didn't fire those rounds. Hall leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This meant only one thing. There was another gun, and it was still out there. Hall pulled David's confession file and scanned through his written statement again. David admitted to pulling the trigger, admitted to killing Lillian, but never once had he described the gun. Never once did he say where it came from. He had confessed, but left out that one key detail. Hall stood, grabbed his coat, and made his way back to the jail. This time he wasn't asking for a lawyer to be present. When Hall sat across from David in the visitor's room, David looked even thinner than before. His skin pale, eyes sunken. "You lied to us," Hall began. David blinked slowly. "About what?" "The gun," Hall said sharply. "The one we found isn't the murder weapon." David's lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile again. Hall slammed the lab report onto the table. "Where's the real weapon?" David stared at the paper for a long time. Finally he said, "Gone?" Hall narrowed his eyes. "Where?" David shrugged. "It doesn't matter anymore." Hall leaned in. "It matters if someone else helped you. It matters if there's more to this story." David's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some things you can't bring back." Hall clenched his fists but knew pushing harder wouldn't work. Not yet. He left the jail frustrated and drove straight to Eric Thomas's apartment. Eric opened the door cautiously. "You again?" Eric asked. Hall pushed inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk about the gun," Hall said. Eric's face drained of color. "I told you, I didn't give her one." "But someone did," Hall said. "And right now you're my best lead." Eric hesitated. "There was someone else." Hall froze. "Who?" Eric took a shaky breath. "Lillian had a friend. Someone she confided in besides me. A woman she worked with. Name's Julie Ramirez." Hall's heart skipped. That name was familiar. Julie Ramirez. Lillian's colleague at the elementary school. Hall pulled out his phone and scrolled through Lillian's recent call history. Julie's number appeared multiple times, especially in the days leading up to the murder. Hall wasted no time. Within the hour, he was sitting across from Julie in her small two-bedroom apartment on the west side of town. Julie looked nervous. Her hands shook as she poured herself a glass of water. When Hall laid the evidence on the table, the texts, the burner phone, the missing weapon, Julie broke. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't think it would go this far," she whispered. Hall's pulse quickened. "What wouldn't?" Julie covered her face with her hands. "She begged me for help," she said. Said she didn't feel safe, that David was following her, watching her. She was scared for the kids. Hall stayed silent, letting her speak. I knew someone. An old friend from high school who still had a gun. I asked him if he'd sell it to me. He said yes. No paperwork. Cash only." Hall's stomach twisted. "So you got the gun for her?" Julie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I gave it to her the week before she died. I thought it was just for protection. I never imagined." Her voice broke. Hall scribbled furious notes. "Where's the gun now?" Julie shook her head. "I don't know. After she died, I panicked. I threw away my phone. Deleted everything. I didn't want to be dragged into this." Hall stood quickly. "Give me the name of the man who sold you that gun." Julie hesitated. "His name's Ricky? Ricky Mendez." Hall left the apartment immediately. A background check showed Ricky had a prior record for illegal firearm sales. A known small-time dealer, operating out of an auto repair shop downtown. That afternoon, officers raided the shop. They found Ricky working under the hood of a beat-up pickup truck. When confronted about the gun, Ricky laughed. "Man, I don't keep track of who buys what," he said. "But yeah, I sold Julie a piece. Couple weeks ago. Small handgun. Black finish. No serial." Hall gritted his teeth. This was a mess. Lillian had been scared enough to get a gun. But somehow, the gun she bought wasn't the one used to kill her. Or was it? The ballistics on Julie's gun hadn't been tested yet, because they hadn't recovered it. Julie's story suggested Lillian kept it, but David never mentioned finding it. So, where was it? Later that night, Hall sat in his office piecing everything together. David's stalking. Lillian's fear. Eric's secret relationship. Julie's involvement in providing a weapon. It felt like every new answer opened 3 new questions. Hall flipped through the surveillance photos David had taken. Zooming in on one from 2 days before the murder, he noticed something he hadn't caught before. In the corner of the frame, near Lillian's parked car, a small, open glove compartment. A black object visible inside. Zooming further, it looked like the handle of a small pistol. Hall's heart started racing. Was that Lillian's gun? Was it still in her car that day? Hall checked the vehicle inventory report from the day of the murder. Lillian's car had been towed and stored after the crime scene was cleared. But there was no mention of a gun recovered from inside. Hall grabbed his keys and headed straight for the impound lot. Under the fading light, he unlocked the driver's side door of Lillian's car. Opened the glove box. Empty. But as he leaned further inside, his flashlight caught something wedged deep between the passenger seat and center console. A small black object. Dusty. Forgotten. Hall reached in and pulled it free. A handgun. Black finish. Small caliber. Hall placed it in an evidence bag and rushed it back to the lab. When the ballistics results came back 3 days later, it confirmed what Hall feared. The gun found inside Lillian's car was the murder weapon, which raised one chilling question. If David's fingerprints weren't on it, and it was hidden inside Lillian's own car, then who really pulled the trigger that day? Detective Hall sat at his desk, staring at the ballistics report like it was written in a foreign language. The gun found in Lillian's car matched the bullets recovered from her body. There was no mistake. And yet, David's fingerprints weren't on it. Not on the grip. Not on the trigger. Not on the magazine. In fact, the only fingerprints found on the weapon belonged to one person. Lillian. Hall's hands trembled as he flipped back through the crime scene photos. Lillian had been shot twice. Both wounds to the chest. Close range. Her body had been found lying near the TV stand. David confessed to pulling the trigger. The children saw him holding a gun. But, which gun? Hall called the forensic lab again. "Rerun the prints on the gun we found in the garage," he said. The technician confirmed the results. David's prints were all over that weapon. But that gun didn't match the ballistic evidence. Hall's mind raced. 2 guns. One used. One unused. One hidden in the garage. One hidden in Lillian's car. And both connected to the same crime. Hall dug back into the crime scene video footage. At minute mark 12:43 there it was. A frame showing David standing in the living room, holding the gun retrieved from the garage. So if David was holding his own gun during the standoff with police, who used Lillian's gun? Or worse, had she used it on herself? Hall's heart pounded. Could this have been a staged scene? A suicide disguised as murder? But the witness statements didn't support that. Noah and Emily both testified they saw their father point a gun and pull the trigger. Hall kept thinking. 2 shots. But what if there had been 2 shooters? The idea was wild, but the evidence was pushing him there. Hall reviewed the kids' initial interviews. Noah said, "Dad pointed the gun." Emily said, "Daddy was holding something, then Mommy fell." Neither child described seeing the actual moment of gunfire with perfect clarity. Hall called the state medical examiner's office. "Pull Lillian's autopsy report," he ordered. When the file arrived, one note stood out. The trajectory of the bullets. Both fired from downward angles. As if the shooter had been standing over her, while she was already on the ground. Hall's hands shook as he connected the dots. Could it be that Lillian had been shot after she had already fallen? That someone else pulled the final trigger? There was one person who might know. Noah. Hall requested a follow-up interview. That afternoon, he sat across from the teenager in a softly lit room with a counselor present. "Noah, I know this is hard," Hall said gently, "but I need you to think carefully." Noah nodded slowly. "I want you to close your eyes," Hall continued, "and remember that day. Remember where everyone was standing." Noah squeezed his eyes shut. "Where was your dad?" Hall asked. "By the garage door," Noah whispered. "And where was your mom?" "Near the TV stand." Hall leaned forward. "Did you ever see your dad point the gun directly at her?" Noah hesitated. I heard the shot. Then I looked up. She was already on the floor." Hall's stomach dropped. "So you didn't actually see him pull the trigger?" Noah opened his eyes. I thought I did." Hall glanced at the counselor, who gave him a subtle nod. "Noah, is it possible that when you heard the gunshot, your dad wasn't pointing the gun at her?" Noah started to cry. "I don't know, everything happened so fast." That night, Hall reviewed every statement again. Something still felt wrong. Julie's confession about providing the gun, Eric's sudden disappearance, David's obsession with surveillance, Lillian's secret recording. And now, a new question. Could someone else have been in the house that day? Hall pulled the neighborhood security footage. A camera from across the street caught something strange. A shadow moving near the side gate, minutes before the shooting. Hall froze the frame. The shape was unclear, but it looked like a person. Hall enhanced the image as best as he could. Tall, thin build, wearing a hoodie. Hall's heart pounded. Eric. Hall checked phone tower pings from Eric's number that day. The result left him speechless. Eric's phone had pinged off a tower less than 2 blocks from the Whitaker home, at the exact time of the shooting. Hall drove straight back to Eric's apartment. This time, officers were waiting with a warrant. Inside they found a backpack hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside the bag, a second burner phone. And in the photo gallery, a single image. A blurry photo of Lillian, sitting on a park bench, holding her phone. Timestamped 2 hours before the murder. Hall pulled Eric into the interrogation room. "We need to talk about where you really were that day," Hall said. Eric's face went pale. "I wasn't there," he stammered. Hall threw the printed phone tower data onto the table. "Then explain this." Eric's breathing grew rapid. Sweat dripped from his forehead. Finally, he broke. "I just wanted to scare her," he blurted out. "Make her realize how serious I was. I never meant for any of this." Hall's heart sank. "Were you in the house?" he asked. Eric shook his head violently. "No. I stayed near the side gate. I watched. But I never went inside." "Did you see David?" Eric nodded slowly. "I saw him pacing inside the living room, with the gun." Hall's head spun. Everything was tangled. Eric outside. David inside. Lillian, somewhere between fear and survival. But even with Eric's admission, the truth about who fired the fatal shots still wasn't fully clear. Before leaving the room, Hall turned back. "One last thing, Eric." Eric lifted his head. "Why were you taking photos of Lillian that morning?" Eric swallowed hard. "Because she told me she was planning to meet someone that afternoon." "Who?" "I don't know," Eric whispered. "But she said, if she didn't come home that night, it wouldn't be David's fault." Hall froze. "What do you mean?" Eric shook his head. "That's all she said." Hall's blood ran cold. Someone else? Another person? Another layer? The case just took another turn. Detective Hall sat motionless in his car, replaying Eric's last words over and over in his head. If she didn't come home that night, it wouldn't be David's fault. What did Lillian mean by that? Hall flipped through his notes. Every interview, every phone record, every message. All of it pointed to David and Eric, but now, there was this third unknown factor. Who was Lillian planning to meet that afternoon? The next morning, Hall pulled Lillian's personal calendar from evidence. On Saturday, the day she died, there was one cryptic entry written in her own handwriting. 2 p.m., meeting at Willow Park. Willow Park. A small, quiet stretch of green space 3 blocks from the Whitaker house. Mostly empty on weekends. Hall checked with the parks department for any available surveillance. No cameras. But a nearby gas station had one pointed toward the park entrance. Hall requested the footage. Scrolling through the time window between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., something caught his eye. A dark gray sedan pulled into the park parking lot at 1:58 p.m. The driver stayed in the car for about 15 minutes, then drove away. The license plate was partially visible. Hall ran it through the system. The car was registered to a name he didn't expect. Mark Reynolds, Lillian's co-worker. The very man David had suspected from the beginning. Hall felt a surge of frustration. Why hadn't Mark's name come up again after the first few interviews? Hall pulled Mark's original statement from weeks ago. According to the file, Mark had told detectives he hadn't seen Lillian outside of school in over a month. But now, the timestamp proved otherwise. Hall drove straight to Mark Reynolds' house. Mark answered the door, looking surprised but calm. "Detective Hall? This is unexpected." Hall didn't waste time. "We need to talk, now." Mark invited him in. The house was neat, clean, almost too perfect. Hall showed him the printout of the surveillance frame. "Recognize this car?" Mark's face changed instantly. His smile disappeared. I can explain." "I'd love to hear it," Hall said, folding his arms. Mark sank onto the couch. "Lillian called me that morning," Mark began. "She sounded scared. She asked me to meet her at the park. She said it was important." "Did you meet her?" Mark nodded. "I waited in the parking lot. She showed up, got in my car. She told me she was leaving David for good. Said she had something she needed to tell me but didn't have time right then." "What did she need to tell you?" Hall asked. Mark shook his head. "She wouldn't say. She just kept repeating, 'If anything happens to me today, remember I trusted you.'" Hall's heart pounded. "Why didn't you tell us this before?" Mark looked down at his hands. "Because I was scared. When I heard she'd been killed, I panicked. I thought if I admitted I'd seen her that day, it would look bad for me." Hall's mind raced. This entire case had been built on incomplete stories, half-truths, and withheld details. He leaned forward. "Mark, do you own a firearm?" Mark's eyes widened. "No, never." "Would you consent to a search of your home?" Mark hesitated, but then nodded. That afternoon, officers searched Mark's house top to bottom. No weapons. No suspicious evidence. Just stacks of old lesson plans, books, and family photos. But something kept bothering Hall. Mark's timeline still left a gap. If he left the park around 2:15 p.m., he would have had enough time to return home long before the murder occurred. Yet Hall couldn't shake the feeling that Mark knew more than he was saying. Later that night, Hall sat in his office staring at the case board. Photos of David, Lillian, Eric, Julie, Mark. Strings connecting names, places, and timelines crisscrossed the board like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The lab's final report arrived. David's gun from the garage had never been fired. Lillian's gun, now confirmed as the murder weapon, had only David's and Lillian's prints. Eric's alibi remained shaky. Mark's connection to that day remained questionable. And the most important point, no clear witness had actually seen David fire the gun. Noah and Emily's statements were based on what they believed they saw, after hearing the gunshot. The DA called Hall late that night. "I'm getting nervous about this case," the DA said. "The evidence isn't lining up the way we thought." Hall agreed. "We've got enough to keep David in prison, but not enough for the truth." Before ending the call, the DA added, "Keep digging." The next morning, Hall received an unexpected voicemail. It was from Julie. Her voice was shaking. "Detective Hall, you need to come to my apartment. No, there's something you should see." Hall drove over immediately. Julie opened the door with puffy eyes and trembling hands. She handed him an envelope. "This was left on my doorstep this morning," she said. Inside was a printed photo. Lillian, standing at Willow Park, talking to Mark, and just behind them in the distance, another figure. Someone wearing a dark hoodie, face obscured, but tall, thin. Could it be Eric? Hall turned the photo over. On the back, one sentence was written. "You've been looking in the wrong direction all along." Julie stared at him. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice cracking. Hall had no answer. But as he held the photo, his phone buzzed with a new call. The number was blocked. He answered quickly. "Detective Hall." A deep voice replied. "You want the truth?" the caller said. "Meet me tonight. Midnight. Willow Park." The line went dead. Hall's heart raced. He grabbed his coat, holstered his badge, and headed for the door. One thing was certain. This story wasn't over yet. Midnight at Willow Park. The moon hung low, casting pale light across the empty playground and picnic tables. The air was cool and every sound felt louder in the silence. Detective Hall parked his car at the far end of the lot and stepped out slowly, scanning the area. No sign of anyone. No moving shadows. Just trees, empty benches, and the faint hum of a nearby street lamp. Hall waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, footsteps approached from the trail leading toward the wooded area behind the park. A figure emerged. But up. Hands in jacket pockets. Hall's right hand rested on his holster but didn't draw. The figure stopped about 15 feet away. "Who are you?" Hall called out. The person pulled back the hood. It was Mark Reynolds. Hall's heart sank. "You?" he said. "You're the one who called me?" Mark nodded, eyes dark and tired. "You're chasing ghosts, detective," Mark said quietly. "And I'm done watching everyone lie." Hall took a slow step forward. "Then start talking." Mark exhaled shakily. "The day Lillian died. I wasn't just meeting her at the park," he said. "She told me something. Something I couldn't forget." Hall's pulse quickened. She said she thought someone was following her. Hall narrowed his eyes. "David?" Mark shook his head. "No, someone else. She said she kept seeing the same silver SUV parked near the school, near the grocery store, even outside the kids' soccer practice." Hall froze. That detail had never come up in any interview. Mark's voice cracked. "She said she didn't want to tell anyone because she thought people would assume it was David, or me, or Eric. But she didn't recognize the vehicle. Or the driver." Hall's mind raced. "Why didn't you tell us this earlier?" Mark shrugged bitterly. "Because I didn't want to get dragged any deeper into this. I thought, with David arrested, it was over." Hall ran a hand through his hair. "A silver SUV. A new piece, this late in the game. Did she ever describe the driver?" Hall asked. Mark nodded slowly. "She said it was a woman." Hall froze. That detail hit him like a punch. A woman? The only woman consistently tied to Lillian was Julie. Hall didn't waste time. Within 30 minutes he was pounding on Julie Ramirez's door. No answer. Lights off. Her car, missing from the driveway. Hall pulled her phone records from the last 2 months. One number kept appearing again and again. A number linked to a second burner phone. Hall dialed. It rang, then went to voicemail. No outgoing message. Just silence. Hall rushed to the station and pulled Julie's employment file. One address stood out. A small storage unit registered under her name, different from the one where they found Lillian's letters. By dawn, officers were cutting the lock on the unit door. Inside was the silver SUV, dusty, parked against the back wall. In the driver's seat, a small revolver. Hall's stomach turned. Ballistics would need to confirm it, but Hall already had a sinking feeling. They opened the trunk next. Inside, stacks of photos. All surveillance shots of Lillian. At the park. At work. At her kids' school. Most disturbing. A handwritten journal, with detailed notes about Lillian's routines. And one final entry dated 2 days before the murder. "If she won't leave him, I'll make sure he leaves her." Hall's heart dropped. Julie. The friend who'd provided the gun. The friend who cried on the witness stand. The friend who acted shocked at every new development. It had been her, all along. Motivated by obsession. Hall raced back to the station and put out an APB for Julie Ramirez. By mid-morning, she was spotted heading north on the interstate. An unmarked unit intercepted her near the state line. When they pulled her over, she didn't resist. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just sat in the back seat, staring out the window. At the station, Hall sat across from her one last time. Her eyes, cold, detached. "Why?" Hall asked. Julie gave a small, tired smile. "Because she was never going to choose me," she whispered. Hall's skin went cold. "You loved her," he said quietly. Julie nodded. "For years, I was always the friend, the backup, the shoulder to cry on." Her gaze hardened. "But when she told me she was going back to David, that she was giving him another chance, I snapped." Hall's stomach twisted. "You followed her that day." Julie smiled bitterly. "I was at the side of the house. I saw David pacing with his gun. I waited until she fell, then I made sure she stayed down." Hall closed his eyes. It all made sense now. David had fired first. Or maybe froze. Lillian had collapsed. And Julie, standing unseen at the side window, had fired the fatal shots. David, consumed by rage and confusion, had picked up his own gun and stood over her. By the time the police arrived, everyone had blood on their hands. Julie leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Funny thing is, none of you ever figured it out." Hall stood slowly. "This time we did." In the weeks that followed, Julie Ramirez was charged with first-degree murder. David's conviction was overturned pending a new trial. Eric Thomas was cleared of all charges but remained under watch. And Noah and Emily began counseling with trauma specialists to begin healing from the nightmare that had consumed their family. At Lillian's memorial service, Hall stood at the back of the church, listening, watching, wondering how many other stories like this started with good intentions and ended in tragedy. As he left the church, Hall's phone buzzed. Another case, another call. But as he drove away from Willow Park, one thought stayed with him. Sometimes, the real danger isn't the person you fear the most. It's the one standing right next to you, pretending to protect you. Before you go, what's your take on this case? Do you think justice was finally served? Or do you believe there are still unanswered questions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more untold crime stories that reveal the hidden truths behind family betrayals and cases just like this, subscribe for more untold crime stories. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next twist in this case.